Alrighty. Thank you, David. So I'm Isaac Johnson. I'm a third-year PhD student at Northwestern. But today I'll be talking about some work I did last summer as a Google User Experience Research intern with the Geo Group, specifically with the support of my co-authors, Schwanda, Sosik, and Kacey, Ballard. At a very high level, we ran a mixed method survey to better understand how an individual's familiarity with an area affects what information is most useful to them in local search. And to help you understand how we got to this point, though, I'm going to walk through some of these terms. So thanks to Hua-Yan, we already have an introduction into local search, but as a refresher, local search, as I'm talking about today, is the collision of maps and search. It's the act of looking for things in the world, often nearby, to fulfill some need. And commonly, this is related to dining, but it could also be shopping or health or tourism related, to name a few other areas. I'll be focusing on dining today. By familiarity, I mean how comfortable you are with a particular geographic area and the places that are there. And I should say at this point that I'm thinking about humans here, but that was a fascinating point made by Nancy earlier in the previous talk. This matters in animals like leopards too. But there's been some excellent past work that we built on here, investigating how an individual's familiarity with an area changes the way they think about the place. For instance, the hand-drawn map on this slide is from a study by Frank Bentley and colleagues, in which they asked people to draw maps of Chicago and then compared how these maps differed depending on whether they were drawn by individuals who were familiar with the city or people who were unfamiliar with the city, primarily tourists. So in this map, you see a lot of landmarks, which is more typical of the tourist maps. Whereas in this one, you would see focus on neighborhoods or broader areas of the city, which is more typical of longer-term residents. And additionally, from work by Church and Kramer, we know that familiarity with an area also is important in to help people decide between places in local search results. For instance, helping people to choose between two restaurants in two different parts of a city. Which leads to our question of impact. So we know familiarity is important to how people recall their surroundings, and we know it's important for what places people choose in local search, but what we don't know is, do the varying needs and recall patterns of users with different levels of familiarity actually translate into different information preferences? For example, if you're familiar with Denver, we know this might affect how you think about the city and which areas you prefer to eat in. But how might this change what information in local search would actually be most useful to you when you search for a restaurant to eat lunch at nearby? Alrighty, so what did we do exactly? As I mentioned earlier, we ran a mixed method survey, and I'll walk you through an example in a second. Because there are a lot of pieces of information provided to users during local search that we could probe, we narrowed our study down to the location description. For example, there are multiple options for this restaurant, Stout Street Social. You could provide the address. We could also provide the cross streets, that is the nearest intersection to the restaurant, the neighborhood the restaurant is in, a landmark such as a park that covers a substantial area, a more specific landmark such as the convention center, or a nearby city train station, and of course there are bound to be other types of references too. So what our survey looked like is this. We first would introduce the survey participant to a restaurant, this one being a restaurant in Portland, Oregon. And then we got to the heart of the survey, which is asking the person to select which of the location descriptions, like the ones I showed you earlier, is most useful to them. And the data from this question allows us to test quantitatively whether an individual's familiarity with an area had a significant effect on the usefulness of different types of information. And then we collected some qualitative data as well to deepen our understanding of why different location descriptions are more useful to different people. And finally, we finished with our measure of familiarity. So, quickly, just the remaining details. We ran this survey in 7 cities across a variety of cultures. We chose a single restaurant to ask about in each city. We also varied the specific phase of local search asked about in the survey. I'm not going to focus on this aspect today, but we issued 2 types of surveys to each city, where the only difference was one asked the respondent which location description was most useful for deciding where to eat, and the other asked which location description was most useful for figuring out how to get to there. And with 100 people per survey, that gave us 1,400 respondents. And finally, because we needed a balance of people who would be both familiar and unfamiliar with the city, we used Google Surveys, which allowed us to geofence each survey. So for instance, the surveys on Portland only went to people living in Oregon, the state in which Portland is located. So what do we expect our results to look like? So each type of location description from the survey will have its own graph. The y-axis represents the percentage of respondents who chose that location description, and the x-axis will be the categories of respondents with the least familiar participants on the left and the most familiar on the right. And if there's a strong relationship between familiarity and a given type of location description, either the popularity of that particular location description will increase as familiarity increases, or the inverse, it'll decrease as familiarity increases. And so now looking at the results for all of the location descriptions, we see that different descriptions have different relationships to familiarity. And in general, there's also a great variety in which location descriptions respondents chose. So no single location description was selected as the most useful for a majority of the time. So most clearly, landmarks are preferred by unfamiliar respondents. And when we asked them why in the survey, they said things like the description indicated that the restaurant was near a tourist site that they were familiar with. So they recognized the location description, though they had never been there, and despite the location description not being particularly specific, it at least provided some useful information at a quick glance. Other times, the respondents also said that landmarks were useful for letting them know what they might do alongside eating out at the restaurant. For familiar respondents, on the other hand, neighborhoods were clearly preferred. So many times, the neighborhood name was very easy to recognize and provided them with a lot of quick context about the restaurant's location, as well as matching up with their mental maps of the city, as this quote indicates. We saw this mental map piece appear elsewhere too. For instance, familiar respondents would choose the nearest transit station because they knew the transit station well and could recognize the station name. Additionally, before wrapping up, I'll mention some other aspects from this paper that I did not have time to get to today. So I showed you plots of the results. We also used logistic regressions with some demographic control variables to more robustly determine the significance of differences. And the person's task or goal, that is whether they're trying to choose a restaurant or figure out how they might get there, is also important and modifies these results somewhat too. And finally, locale matters too. I mentioned we did the surveys in 7 cities across a variety of cultures. We also noticed some interesting city-specific trends. For instance, cross streets were especially popular in New York City because of its grid-like nature. So wrapping up, what's the big takeaway? Well, we found that varying information needs and recall based on familiarity also translated into varying usefulness of different types of location descriptions, meaning it would be beneficial to personalize the information provided to someone in local search based upon their familiarity with that area. And with that, I'll end it. I'd like to thank my co-authors and Google in general for supporting this work. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
So I hate to be like the person who's like, but what about X when you did Y? Mm-hmm. But this is the kind of thing that we all do every day, and we have been doing just now, so of course it's in my mind. I feel like, in addition to familiarity with locale, the kind of information that's going to be important is going to depend on like my mode of transport at the time and the weather, right? Like if it's raining, then I want to know things like, oh, well, is it near a bus stop so I don't have to walk there? But if it's not raining, then maybe the cross streets are more important. Mm-hmm. And I don't know from the results that you had, if you had a window onto what kinds of additional contextual information might be important in understanding which one of those options is more useful at any particular point in time.
Yeah, it's a very good point. There definitely are a lot of contexts that affect essentially what piece is most useful to people. The qualitative results were nice in that, and like I mentioned, the mental maps piece, that was really big, and you saw it wasn't just like some people it was the cross streets, like they just knew the grid of their city well, and they said, I chose this one because like I know where these streets are, and so I can immediately pinpoint that. Other people, they knew kind of like, they suggested they knew the neighborhood structure and like what neighborhoods are near other ones, or a transit station, like getting to how people tend to get there. So they say, I take the train a lot, so that transit station, I know where that is, it's on the way home, like I can, I know I can easily work it into my schedule. So we saw some of those things start to come out in the kind of open response fields, and it was very interesting, but it's clear that, yeah, it's not just, it's not one factor that affects us. There's a lot of different things coming into play. But yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much for this work. I'm curious, a lot of the cities you chose were really big. How do you think the results would be different if we're like in Portland, Maine instead of Portland, Oregon?
Yeah, and that's an interesting. So part of that was the kind of the limitations of our survey device. So we're able to geofence to a state. So we're trying to choose cities where we'd still be able to get a lot of people from that city if we were just geofencing to the state. So we're avoiding like states like California where you'd get a lot of people in San Francisco, a lot of people in Los Angeles. But regarding how it would actually differ. I guess we wouldn't know without really looking into it. I suspect something like neighborhoods, which is a clear big level feature, and in larger cities, maybe there's less, there's fewer neighborhoods, and so maybe even unfamiliar people would recognize them, or maybe they're used less. But I would suspect that it's not necessarily big city versus small city, just the individual quirks of each city. So like I said, we saw big differences between Tokyo and between New York City, despite both being very large cities, but just the way people get around and interact with their city matters quite a bit.